When Terry Virgo formed a team ministry and invited me to be his administrator, I immediately said yes because I'd felt the call of God on my life. But I was also very conscious that I was not really trained as an administrator. I was trained as a professional engineer. And so I needed to find out from the scriptures what biblical administration was about. I wondered whether I should take some sort of secular training in administration, but I came to the conclusion that I would rather root and found the work that God had called me to do on a scriptural foundation rather than on a worldly one. And so I dug around in many of the scriptures, and one of the important passages to me was Mark chapter 6. Quite simply, I found in this chapter a model administrator, and particularly a model administrator for managing events. Who was that model? Well, it was Jesus. I suppose if I asked you, how would you describe Jesus? What was his gifting? You would more likely come up with, well, he was a prophet, he was a teacher, he was a miracle worker. But I rather doubt if any of you would say that he was an administrator. And yet I see in this important passage the administrative gift in operation. And I want to share that with you in this session, because it provides us with a model of managing an event. And so many of us do that regularly, whether it's the Sunday service or whether it's a major conference. But first, let's just have a look at the context that he was ministering in, and then we will look at some of the key features of the event that he was managing. The context at the beginning of Mark chapter 6 is that he is in Nazareth. We don't know exactly whether this was the first visit or the second visit. There's another passage in Luke chapter 4 which was definitely the first visit, when he went into the synagogue, having come out of the wilderness and having had some time in Galilee performing miracles and ministering in various ways. And he then read that passage from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 61, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor." And on that occasion, every eye was upon him, because he obviously had read that passage with a different authority from the authority that the priest would normally read such a passage. On this occasion, he also visited the synagogue, and maybe indeed it was the same occasion. But there it says that he taught, and many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things, and what is this wisdom given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hand. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon?" In other words, they knew him, and they could not get their mind around the fact that someone who had grown up in their midst could now be performing these amazing miracles. Whether it was the first visit or the second visit, or whether the two records are actually merged in the different Gospels, is not important. Commentators are not decided, not unified as to whether he made one or two visits back to Nazareth, but never mind. He was in Nazareth, his hometown. He tried to perform miracles, and indeed we find that he did heal some. But before he left, he said that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. In other words, if someone comes with a prophetic ministry and anointing from God from a long way away, we all tend to receive them as being godly people. But if they emerge from our midst, for some reason we're a bit more critical. And this bred unbelief in the minds of those he had grown up with. And so he left Nazareth. They missed out on much blessing, I'm sure. But he had hit that opposition. The next part of the passage, Mark 6 and chapter 7, says, "He summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs, and he was giving them authority over unclean spirits. And he instructed them that they should take nothing for their journey except a mere staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belt. I wonder if you can picture the disciples on that occasion. They had obviously been with Jesus for a few months. They had seen him perform miracles. No doubt they'd applauded. No doubt when mingling amongst the crowd, they maybe tended to boast a little bit. Oh, we're with him. As if they in some way were special people and could also perform miracles. But then when he turns around and he says to them in as many words, okay, you've seen me do it, now I want you to do it. I would imagine that their enthusiasm waned a little bit. And that those who had been close to Jesus would probably kind of merge to the back of the group and leave someone else close to him. Because quite simply, they had been living off his faith. They had watched him perform miracles. They had heard him teach. They had identified with him, but they hadn't really considered that they necessarily would be able to do the same. And yet a good principle of teaching is to take someone with you and to get them to work alongside you, teach them all you know, then get them to do it and you watch what they do. And in due course you can release them and say, okay, you go off and do it now. We don't know whether any of that second phase had already happened, whether Jesus had said to Peter perhaps, why don't you pray for this person? There's no record of that. But what we do know is that it got to a stage where he said, right, it's now time for you to go and test out whether you are in a position to operate in the way that I have. You've watched me do it, you know what to do, now go and do it. And so you can picture those disciples going off in pairs, the very first ministry trip they'd made on their own. And they were going a little bit hesitantly, and they weren't necessarily very enthusiastic. And just to make life a bit more difficult for them, Jesus also said, don't take anything for your journey except just a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belt. Wear sandals, but don't take 2 tunics. And wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave. And any place that doesn't receive you or listen to you, go out from there and shake off the dust from the soles of your feet for a testimony against them. So he really didn't make it easy. He didn't give them addresses of friends that he could go and call on, that they could find a bed for the night, that they could get a meal. He sent them out, and they were on their own with God the Father. And as they went, sure enough, they hesitantly, no doubt, started to teach. Maybe they found someone who was sick, and a little hesitantly perhaps they laid hands on them, and lo and behold, they saw them healed. And they got excited. And maybe their faith grew at a huge rate. And the next person they saw who was sick and they prayed for him was also healed. And their faith skyrocketed. And they would talk to each other, no doubt, as they walked along, and they said, come on, let's try this, let's try that, because their faith had been kindled. Now, it couldn't have happened if they'd stayed with Jesus, because they were leaning on his faith. But they were out of their comfort zone now, and they were praying with the sick themselves, and no doubt teaching and so on. And so they've moved from a place in Nazareth where there was opposition to Jesus' teaching, and they're now on their own. No doubt they are getting a bit of barracking, I expect, from the crowd, but on the whole they're doing well. And then we find, as we read on in this passage, that word had gone out to the extent that King Herod had heard what Jesus was doing, and perhaps the disciples. Now, King Herod had a bit of a conscience. Quite simply, he had married his brother's wife. And John the Baptist had confronted him and told him that that was wrong. And he had a real conscience about it. And you remember the story how once he held a feast and Salome, his wife's daughter, started dancing at that feast and really impressed Herod. No doubt he was a bit drunk. Maybe he was caught up with the lure of this beautiful young woman dancing in front of him. But he said to her, "I will give you whatever you ask, even to half the kingdom." And she went and asked her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And her mother said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist." Herod had put John in prison, but he had a certain respect for him, because when this happened, he found himself very sad and very sorry. She said, "I want you to give me right away the head of John the Baptist." And although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded him to bring back his head. And that happened. And John's head was brought in on a huge platter, and Salome gave it to the king. And that grieved the king. Now, the reason that he was concerned was a matter of conscience. But you can imagine how this would also produce some opposition to Jesus' ministry and to the ministry of the disciples who had been sent out. And so from there we move on into the story of Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. And I'm taking in that event of feeding the 5,000 a model for event management. Let's just look at what we mean by an event. An event could be a church meeting every Sunday. It could be a conference. It could be an evangelistic outreach into the city. There are many events. And we need to have some understanding of what we mean by an event and what we mean by a ministry. Quite simply, an event tends to be a one-off happening. It's got a beginning and an end, whereas a ministry is ongoing. So there's a clear time boundary around an event. You know that your Sunday meeting will start at perhaps 10:30 and maybe will end at 12:30, 1 o'clock, depending on how long your services normally go on. But a ministry is open-ended. It's cyclical, but it's open-ended. Very often it will reflect something to do with the calendar, but nevertheless it'll go on and on. It hasn't got a strong ending to it. Next, an event is somewhere where you can monitor progress during the planning. As you're planning for your Sunday meeting or as you're planning for your conference, there is a certain kind of checklist that you need to tick off. And you can monitor the progress, typically against the run-up time. So each week, no doubt, there is a news sheet to be printed, ready for the Sunday event. There's the worship leader and worship team who need to be contacted, and they need to, in turn, have a rehearsal. There are various things that happen as you head towards an event, which need planning, which need administration. Now, obviously, there are certain things that happen with a ministry as well. But there, the planning may be quite similar, but what you then do is to monitor the performance. You monitor how the people who you're seeking to minister to are being blessed, how they're being helped. Is maturity coming into their lives? Maybe it's a ministry to people who are street homeless. Well, as you encounter them, is their situation better today than it was a month ago? Have they not only been brought off the street and helped with some accommodation, but maybe put on a training program of some sort towards getting employment so they can be self-sufficient? A ministry has a different feel to it and is planned in a different way. An event tends to have tasks associated with it. I've already mentioned some of them about a news sheet or about a band practice. Whereas the ministry is much more about people and we need to be sensitive to their needs and who they are. Once the event is in train, once it's happening, of course it's all about people. But in the planning and the administration supporting it, it tends to be more towards task. So an event I have defined as a people gathered together for a defined and time-limited purpose. So let's now look at the passage that we were wanting to. Here is the context, which I've already touched on, in Mark chapter 6, 1-6, about him being in Nazareth. And then in Mark chapter 6, verses 7-13, sending out 2 by 2. And then the opposition that came through Herod and others. And then in verse 30, we find that the disciples return. They come back to Jesus and they are very excited, they're very animated because so much has happened. They tell how people have been healed. They tell how demons are being cast out. And they're just tumbling over themselves to try and tell Jesus this good news. I think you can imagine them each trying to do a little bit better than another couple who have come back. Now I'm sure that Jesus is glowing inside. I'm sure he's thrilled with all the stories he's hearing. It's rather like when your children come home having achieved something at school. You are very proud as a parent. And I'm sure that Jesus was proud of them. They'd gone out with just a little bit of faith. And as they had sought to do what he did, so they found that miracles did happen. And he could take pride in the fact that, in one sense, they'd been well taught and they'd matured. But he recognized that there were also lessons that they could learn. And so, because they have come back to him, and no doubt there's a crowd around him, he says, let's go away to a quiet place and let's talk about this, let's share the stories. And indeed, let's learn, are there things that you did that you could have done better? What did you notice about each other as one was ministering? Did the other observe anything? Were you ever a little bit too harsh in talking to someone? Were you too long-winded and not coming to the point? Were you praying as your colleague was ministering, and so on? There were many points that he could perhaps bring out of this experience. But he recognized that to do so in a crowded place was not going to be very easy. And so they got into a boat and they rowed across the lake, because he knew of a little cove where they could run up onto the beach and just sit quietly and talk. But unfortunately for them, we find that when we get to verse 33, that they aren't alone at all. Because we read, the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities, and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now you can picture the scene. They're sailing or rowing across the lake. And as they go towards this little cove, they see the crowd following them on the beach as they're going along the coastline. So that when they get to the place they'd intended to stop there on the beach, and no doubt on the hills behind, there is a huge crowd. We find out later that there were 5,000 men. We don't know how many women and children. A lot of people. And Jesus had an internal decision to make. He had committed to the disciples that they would go away and he would catch up on all their stories and he would teach them out of it. It was going to be a kind of workshop experience. And then he had all these people waiting for him to speak. If he ignored the people and went with the disciples, was that a ploy of the enemy to distract him? That he should be meeting with those people? Or on the contrary, if he stopped and ministered to the people, was it a ploy of the enemy to draw him away from the disciples? Well, in one sense, no to both of those questions, because I don't believe it was enemy activity at all. But what he had within him were those verses that he had read in the synagogue in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. So he had his commission. Indeed, that's often called the kingdom mandate. I tend to use the expression, it was Jesus' job description. But he had been commissioned by God the Father to go and minister to the poor. The good news is upon me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set the captives free. Captives there is captive to circumstances, not captive as in prison. So people who have been abandoned as children and are orphaned, they're captive to their circumstances. So Jesus knew that his commission was about ministering to people, and it was to bind up the brokenhearted. It was to bring people hope and to set the captive free. And here in front of him were thousands of people, and he said, they're like sheep without a shepherd. Now, sheep without a shepherd are in serious problems. They can wander the hillside, they can be attacked by wolves, they can fall down a crevasse and not be able to get out. They don't know how to look for grass for themselves. Sheep need a shepherd. And here he saw these people unled. They needed a shepherd. They were poor. They probably were economically poor, but the expression poor is much wider than just to do with how much money you have in your pocket. They were abandoned, they were disadvantaged, probably many of them had no job or no easy income. They weren't selling a few bananas on the roadside, they weren't employed by anyone. And so they were in need of help. Did they come into the description of poor as in Jesus' job description? Yes, of course they did. And so in stopping to minister to them, Jesus wasn't being distracted. And we'll see later how he didn't forget the disciples. He still came and talked to them about their stories and so on. But for a time he put that on hold, and he started ministering to these thousands and thousands of people. And so as we read on, we find that when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" Jesus, you see, had been teaching on the hillside throughout the day. We don't know when it started, but we do know the sun is beginning to go down. And in Israel it can get very hot. I don't suppose many people have brought water, or we know they hadn't brought much food, because they didn't expect to sit on the hillside for hours on end listening to Jesus teaching. So although we could say the disciples were wrong in distracting Jesus and so on, I think they were actually being very responsible. We all know that preachers, once they get going, can just go on and on a bit. But here, Jesus was teaching, and maybe he was going on and on. I'm sure, very constructively. But nevertheless, maybe not fully aware of the hunger and thirst of the people. But the disciples who were standing with him perhaps could see people looking a little bit faint, looking a little bit hungry and thirsty. And so they went up to him and tapped him on the shoulder and interrupted him while he was preaching his sermon. And his response is a little surprising. He doesn't say, "Oh, goodness me, I'm sorry. Yeah, go home, go home." He turns to the disciples and says, "Well, give them something to eat then." In the natural, that is ridiculous. But Jesus, because he was in touch with the Father and was a man full of faith, he nevertheless believed that they could be fed. I think it's important to say that he was fully man as he was ministering to those people. He had to live in his own faith. We know from elsewhere in the scripture that he says, I only do what the Father tells me. So as a man, he is plugged into the Father and listening all the time to what the Father is saying to him. And clearly, as he said that to the disciples, he himself must have had a rise of faith that they could do this, although naturally speaking, it was impossible. And he asks them, well, how much food is there out there? And they tell him, well, very little. Let's have a look at that. In the next verse, verse 38, how many loaves do you have? Go, look. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. So we know that there was actually very little food available. Someone had brought some lunch, but what is that amongst so many? And so if we look at this through administrative eyes, first of all, he is beginning to create a plan in his mind. He has already set a goal to feed all these people. And he's now beginning to look at the resources available to him. That's something that we all need to do. When we are planning an event, we need to look at the resources that we have available and the resources that we need. That, of course, includes money, because often we have to go buy stuff and hire stuff. It includes physical things, chairs, a PA system, and it includes people. We need to have people to steward the meeting, people to welcome at the door. And so we have to look at the resources that are available to us and also the resources that we need. And by seeing what's available, we then know what we need to go and look for. And so by looking at what was available here, Jesus was recognizing that 5 loaves, 2 fish, a big shortfall compared to what was clearly needed for so many people. And of course, you didn't have a supermarket around the corner. You didn't have shops that would sell lots of food. It would have been quite sparsely populated, no doubt, in that area. And suddenly, for shops to be expected to feed these thousands of people late in the day, was an unreal expectation. So the disciples saying, send them away, was in a sense an unreal expectation, unless they were just going back home and were going to get food there, which is the likely scenario. But equally, Jesus saying, you feed them, well, that was even more ridiculous. And they rightly said, well, even if we had 200 denarii, would that feed this number of people? So what happens next? He commanded them all to sit down by groups on the grass. And they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. You see, they probably had already been sitting on the grass listening to Jesus. But when the disciples came up to him and they started talking, I expect the people at the front stood up and leaned forward a little bit and put their hands to their ears and tried to hear what was being said, because Jesus was in full flow. He was teaching them, and he'd been interrupted, and everyone across the crowd would have known that, even right at the back. They would have stopped hearing his voice and would have seen a little huddle taking place at the front. And so others stood up and pressed forward, and the people at the front heard a little tidbit, and they would tell the people behind them, and then the people behind them, and a rumour would travel back through the crowd. Goodness knows what that rumour said by the time it got to the back of the crowd. But there was some disturbance, there was some lack of order. A crowd milling around, not being led, is quite difficult to handle. And so I believe when Jesus said, get them to sit in 50s and 100s, this had a couple of purposes. First of all, he did know where he was going. He knew he was going to feed them, and to feed them in 50s and 100s is more practical because you can move amongst people if they're in smaller blocks than if they're all together huddled in a huge crowd. But I think more important, he had lost some of the authority that he had had when he had been teaching them, and he needed to get that back. He needed the people once again to focus on him and to pay attention to what he was saying. And when you're managing an event, it's very important for people to know who is leading this process. If I have a problem, where do I go? There's an expression, the buck stops here. And someone in authority, be he a president or a prime minister, ultimately the government of that country, the buck stops with him. And the same is true in the church. The buck stops with the elders. And in any local event, there always has to be a leader, someone where the buck stops, where ultimately, if you can't get an answer or a decision made, you know who to go to. And he or she carries that ultimate responsibility. And Jesus needed to re-establish this authority amongst the crowd. Because they had been a bit of a rabble, he needed to re-establish and say, shush, quieten down a little bit. And then he would start perhaps teaching them or telling them what was going to happen. We don't know. We haven't got any detail in there. So what did he then do? In verse 41 we read, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food, and he broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all. So first of all, we find he looked up towards heaven. Maybe many of you at the start of a meal will offer a prayer up to Jesus of thanksgiving for the food. And here we have Jesus taking those 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he takes them in his hand and he kind of offers them up before the Father, and he says, Father, here are these 5 loaves and 2 fish, thank you for them, multiply them. And so in doing that, he is tapping into the resource in heaven, which we all have, of being able to go to the Father and say, Father, I'm just a man, I'm bringing this before you, I'm in faith that you will multiply them. And that's very important also when we're organising events. There are many occasions when I have been responsible for perhaps quite a big event, and perhaps something has not turned up that should have done. A piece of hired equipment or something we were meant to purchase. Or a problem has occurred, there's been an accident or a breakage. And I've had to exercise my own faith that God will provide what I need to get that event running. It's no good me leaning on someone like Terry Virgo. I can't just get on the phone and say, Terry, I've got a problem, I'm relying on your faith to solve it. No, you need your own faith. In the story of the early church in Acts chapter 6, when the disciples or the apostles gathered 7 men to solve a pastoral problem, they were looking for men full of the Holy Spirit, it says. They were men who were mature in their faith, men who knew how to seek God and how to exercise their own faith to bring resolution to a problem. And the same is true here with Jesus. He is exercising his faith and trusting that his Father will provide. And so having offered up the loaves to heaven, he then blessed the food and he broke the loaves. And so he offered up perhaps 5 loaves and 2 fish, maybe in a basket, and he brought them down again, and in that basket there were still 5 loaves and 2 fish. There wasn't suddenly an overwhelming expansion of the loaves and the fish. There were still 5 loaves and 2 fish. And there were still thousands of people out there waiting to be fed. And so what did he do? He said he broke it and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them, to set before the people. I like to think that what happened here was that the disciples were around Jesus, expecting him to go and distribute the bread, because he does everything. They had forgotten the fact that they'd just been on a ministry trip where they were actually being used to perform miracles. No, Jesus does it. And they watched and waited to see what would happen. They'd gone to him and said, "You should send the people away." He said, "No, you feed them." And so Jesus, I'm sure, took a loaf and maybe broke it in half. And he said, "Peter, here's a half loaf. Just feed those 50 people, will you?" And Peter perhaps looked at this half loaf and thought, "How can I feed these 50 people?" And maybe he went up to the first one and he said, just broke off a tiny bit and said, "Oh, here's a little bit for you. You don't look very hungry." And as he gave it to the man, perhaps that became a full bread roll. We don't know. The scripture doesn't tell us. But I like to think that Peter and his colleagues were learning faith in actually acting it out. And if that happened, that he gave a little bit of the bit of bread that he had to this person, and it multiplied and became a full roll, no doubt his eyes were out on stalks. And I expect he thought, "I wonder if I can do that again." And that probably is how he thought. Although it was the Lord who multiplied, he probably thought, "I wonder if I can do that again," because we tend to do that, don't we? And maybe he went to the next person and broke off a bit, and the same thing did happen. And he then is almost running down the line, enjoying what is happening, this incredible miracle of multiplication. And no doubt he looked across at the other disciples and said, "Is it happening with you like it's happening with me?" And John said, "What, is it multiplying with you as well?" And sure enough it was. And so you have these disciples moving amongst the crowd, seeing the loaves multiplied and the fish multiplied as they give it out. So their faith is now soaring as well. It's no longer just Jesus' faith, their faith is being built up. Remember, they've only just been on a ministry trip where their faith has been tested, but here it is again. It's a reinforcement. And they get very excited. And Jesus, no doubt, is watching them and thinking, "Oh, well done guys, you're doing well, you're doing a good job." And we find then that after all that, the people were indeed satisfied. Let me just say another word about what was going on there. Jesus could have distributed the food himself. Imagine how long it would have taken, but he could have done it. But he decided to delegate. Why? Was it just to get the job done? No, it was because he knew that the disciples would learn as he delegated. And that's an important principle for us to learn as well. Don't delegate a job just to get it off your back. Delegate strategically. Delegate to people who will benefit from being trusted. Maybe their faith will grow. Maybe they will learn a new skill. But delegate thoughtfully. Delegate prayerfully. Don't just delegate to the first person who comes along because you have a problem. Indeed, I actually don't like asking for volunteers publicly. Sometimes it's necessary. But if we say, "Oh, can we have some volunteers to do such and such?" you'll find the people who volunteer are usually the ones who are very busy already. And they will volunteer out of a certain sense of guilt and desire to help you. I prefer to think, now, what is the task that I'm wanting some help with? What are the giftings I'm looking for? And then I will approach people and say, "I wonder if you could help me with this. I feel that you are peculiarly equipped to do it. Indeed, maybe that's the reason why you're in this church, to do this." An example might be if you have people welcoming on a Sunday as visitors come into your building. Who do you look for? Do you look for just anyone to stand there? No, I look for people with either a gift of encouragement or with a gift of hospitality. Because I want people who can communicate with others and who will be warm, will be affirming, will be encouraging, will know how to open up a conversation without any embarrassment. And so I will intentionally go to certain people whom I see have those gifts. So let's move on. We find in verse 42 that all the people were indeed satisfied. They all ate, they all had enough food and were satisfied. And then as we move on, we find that they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also of the fish. That's the disciples, of course. So the people were satisfied, and presumably then, because the sun had gone down even further, they went off home and they gradually left the hillside. No doubt the hill was covered in bits of fish, bits of bread, other litter. And a good principle at the end of any event is to leave the environment better than you found it. And sure enough, here the disciples go out with baskets. We don't know where they got them from. And they each picked up a whole basketful and came back to Jesus. Now, how do we know that? And why is it recorded? Well, I believe that Jesus took them away and said, we've just had a great time, let's go and talk about it. And we find that there were also 5,000 men who ate the loaves. So they've got some information there. How did they get that information? Do you remember how Jesus was just about to take the disciples away for a debriefing time, and then the crowd appeared on the beach? And so they'd got deflected. Well, I expect he said, okay, it's now getting dusk, let's go and sit under a tree, let's talk about what's just happened. Wasn't that exciting? Wasn't it good? Did you learn anything, Peter? Did you learn anything, John? And so he begins to debrief them. And he said, Judas, who's the accountant, how many people do you think were there? And so Judas says, well, Peter, how many did you have? He said, well, I fed one group of 50 and a couple with 100 in. And Thomas, how many did you have? Well, I had 100 and a 50, and so on. And so Judas, with his abacus or whatever he was using, adds up that number. And he says, Lord, there were 5,000 men. And we only counted the men, but think of all the children there were in the crowd as well, and the wives and the women. And so we have that figure. And we know that each of the disciples had one basketful, so there were 12 of those. And so we have a context where we get this information, and we now, because they wrote it down, have that information available to us thousands of years later. And I'm sure he then went back and said, well, do you remember we were talking about your ministry trip that you went on yesterday? Let's talk about that a bit more. You've just experienced faith here. How did it feel when you went out into the villages and so on? And they recounted then some of their experiences there too. And so the last point that I just want to bring out of this story administratively is the importance of the debrief. Do make sure that when an event is over, you have an opportunity to review it, share the good stories, identify the things that didn't work so well, and make a note of them, so that as you plan for the next event, you can learn from the past. After every Sunday meeting, our elders gather in our church and they review what went on. How did the worship go? Were the gifts of the Spirit exercised? Were they in order? And the preach. Let's even review the preach. So however great the preacher might be, they will still review it and see whether the communication was good, whether the key points were communicated well, and so on. And of course they'll review, did people make any sort of response? Is there a need for follow-up? When I organise an event, I will gather my administrative team. So we had a big leadership conference which we held every year until a couple of years ago, and I was responsible for making that happen. And maybe 4,000 leaders from perhaps 50 different nations would come to that conference. And a few days after that, I would gather my team and say, let's talk about it. First of all, I'd say, well done. That was great. It really went well. We've had some excellent feedback. Look, we've had these emails. Now I'd share some good news stories with them. And then we'd get each person to share, not only from their particular area of responsibility, but what they noticed in other people's areas. And they would write these down. And so we would then use that as the basis for planning the following year's conference. And so that became our first planning conference for 12 months forward. And that date, incidentally, would be put in the diary 2 or 3 months before the conference happens, so that I knew that all the team could come together, because they came from different parts of the country. They weren't a team that was living and working closely with me, but we had good communication, and they brought their particular skills to the various planning meetings and then to the conference itself. So debriefing is just a very, very important part. So let's just recap now what it is that we have talked about. First of all, at the beginning of the story, verses 33 and 34, we read how it was all about people. You see, any event is about people meeting God. That's who we are and why we exist. We exist for Him. We exist to glorify Him. And so an event is not about tasks, it's about people. Second, how Jesus identified the problem and defined the solution. So quickly, the problem was obvious. People needed feeding. The solution? Well, we find out what that solution came to be. He was formulating it in his mind, he was testing the disciples' faith, and he then put it into practice. Next, he assessed resources. What resources do we have? He then went to the Father in faith for provision of more resources. He established authority as he implemented the plan. He made the people sit down and he established his authority. He engaged with the Father. He exercised faith. He then delegated strategically, and he gave the disciples the responsibility for distributing the bread, not only to get the job done, but because he knew they would grow, they would learn by doing it. He then made sure the task was completed. No one went home hungry. You didn't have a group over here saying, "What about us?" No, they all had enough, and they went home satisfied. Then the very good principle of needing to clear up the site, or clear up the venue, pick up the litter, straighten the chairs, have people left behind their Bibles or some garment of clothing. It all needs leaving in a tidy and orderly state. Someone has to do that. So when your congregation or those attending the conference go home and they think that the event is over, you as an administrator know that it's not, that there's still one very important task, and that is to clear up, to turn off the lights, to lock up, and so on. And then finally, the debrief. Now what I want you to do is to take that list, and I want you to think of an event that you might be organising. Maybe it's an outreach into your local town. Maybe it's an event at Christmas or Easter that you want to invite people to in your building. And I'd like you in pairs or in threes, whatever is appropriate to who you are, I want you to take this list, which is on the screen now, and I want you to use it as the basis of planning that event. And we'll give you perhaps 10 or 15 minutes to do that. Okay, how did you get on? Have you done some good planning? We'll talk more about planning on another occasion, but I really wanted just to make sure you'd got hold of the principles that I've been talking about from Mark chapter 6 with Jesus feeding the 5,000. So let's just summarize where we have got to. First, we defined an event. We saw that an event is about people, but it's time bounded. Second, the difference between an event and a ministry. A ministry is ongoing. It doesn't stop at the end of the Sunday service. Next, we looked at Jesus as a model for the event, as a model for managing an event, that is. We saw these various points that you have just done in an exercise. Now, I don't want you to take that as the template for running every event. There is no such thing. The checklist, as it were, for running an event will vary from event to event. But there are some principles in there that you nevertheless would expect to find about resources, about delegation, and so on. And so it's a good starting point, but I don't want you to be slavishly locked into that as the only way to run an event and try and make that template fit everything you organise. And then we concluded by carrying out an exercise. I do want to urge you to review what we've talked about. They're in your notes, and to try and tease out for yourself maybe other points that will be useful to you in your particular context. Nothing will cover all the cultures that this video might reach. There will be things that are peculiar to yours. So take hold of this template and try and interpret it into your culture. And make sure that at the end of events you organise, people can be satisfied as they were on that hillside. How can they be satisfied? Because the event has run so well that they've met with the living God, and they've gone away better people, formed more into the image of Jesus. That's what it's all about.